Welcome to Chapter 17, Evolution of Plant and Fungal Diversity. You will learn very quickly throughout this that while I might love plants, I don't particularly love talking about a lot of plants. We also will be covering plants in depth for like a few chapters in a couple of weeks. And so some I'm going to kind of like skip on over, and I'm going to tell you the main parts to make sure you remember. Intro. Mutually beneficial symbiosis between plants and fungi began 500 million years ago when plants first occupied land. So pretty much plants started in the water with the whole algae and everything, and then they slowly evolved until they moved up and got out on land. That's part of the evolution of what we're going to talk about. So that's what this is talking. Plants supply mycorrhizae with sugars and other organic molecules. This is going to have something to do with the fungus that we talk about. And at least 90% of all plants form this type of relationship. So plants, fungus work together tremendously. But if you remember from the previous PowerPoint, I told you fungus are not plants. I should say fungus is not plants, or fungi are not plants, because, well, fungi is plural. Anyway, you know what I mean. So, big ideas. Plant evolution and diversity, alternation of generations and plant life cycles, and diversity of fungi. These things are fascinating. So, plant evolution and diversity. More than 500 million years ago, the algal ancestors of plants may have carpeted moist fringes of lakes and coastal salt marshes. This basically means, again, it started off in the water and it slowly moved on up and then got out. Pretty much they figure plants and algae have a common ancestor. And then at some point it kind of split. And then it continued. Plants end up being photosynthetic eukaryotes. Life on land offered many opportunities for plant adaptations that took advantage of what was available outside of the water. So we have a whole bunch of sunlight. We have atmospheric carbon dioxide, as in not in the water, but just out here in the air. And initially, what is going on with my words? Few pathogens or plant-eating animals. We know that's not true now, but originally that's what it was. So life on land had disadvantages as well, because they had to figure out how to hold their moisture inside their cells. They needed to find a way to stay upright, because if you're in the water, you're just kind of like this. The water's holding you up. Once it goes on land, it has to find a way to be more rigid. This had to figure out a way to reproduce and spread out its seed without the use of water. They had to figure out how to stay attached to the ground in order to bring the stuff up from the soil, and they had to figure out how to get all of the stuff they needed from the soil and from the air. So some species got this and then got up on land and got farther and farther and farther away from the water. So that's pretty much what we're going to be looking at today. This is just showing you, started off one way, slowly moves its way up. Algae, this is going to be in the water, has to be wet all the time. Moss, these guys still need to be pretty wet, but you can see these on rocks, and so they're not literally in the water, they're starting to come up. But the moss do not have any vascular tissues. They haven't figured out how to keep everything going, and in order to fertilize, in order to reproduce, they have to be wet. The fern's getting closer. The fern has roots that hold it to the ground. It absorbs the water, has vascular tissues, which means veins, and fertilization still requires moisture. We have an image later where you get to see the bottom of the frond, so you can see actually how it spreads the spores. It's kind of cool. And then the next one we're looking at here is a pine tree. This is showing you how well plants adapted to life on land. So here, obviously, we've got the roots that are anchoring it to the ground. We've got the stem that goes way up. It has the pollen, the seeds, everything that spreads out by wind and stuff. So Once it finally got to something as complex as a pine tree, they did not need water in order to reproduce. They still needed water to survive, obviously, but not just to reproduce. Whoa, I went too far. There we go. So this is just trying to show you overall the plant. Not a bad thing to check out. Kind of puts it all together. We're going to talk at length about the actual flower part in a moment. So what adaptations enable plants to grow tall? Well, the vascular tissues to transport materials from below ground parts to above ground parts and vice versa. This is going to be the xylem and phloem. We will talk about this later. And I promise you the main thing I'm going to tell you to remember is xylem up and phloem down. If you can go ahead and start memorizing xylem up, phloem down, that's pretty much how they're getting their nutrients around. 3 key events occurred in the history of the plant kingdom. We have the origin of land plants, and then the origin of vascular plants, and then the origin of seed plants. So first the plants had to get on land. Next they had to develop a vascular system, and then they had to come up with seeds, because all of this, the more complex it got, the farther away from the water it could go. So this is trying to show you again another phylogenetic tree. Millions of years ago, we have the green algae, and then it branches off, the most basic being the liverworts, and then we have mosses and hornworts. All of these are non-vascular. We finally get vascular as we slowly move up. Club mosses, spike mosses, quillworts, this kind of thing. And then we slowly move on up until we get to our seed plants, which are going to be our gymnosperms and angiosperms. Those are the ones we talk the most about. So the non-vascular plants, these are the bryophytes, include mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Then we have our vascular plants, like lignin-hardened vascular tissues that provide strong support. The lignin is what's making where it can actually stand up instead of using water to hold it up. And then ferns, and Fang is saying hello again. Ferns are seedless vascular plants, and yeah. And of course it gets moved again, because every time the kitty jumps on my lap, it gets moved. So here we go. Mosses, liverwort, and hornwort. These are pictures of these just in case you wanted to know what they looked like. When you see moss, no, you don't normally see those brown parts. Oops, those brown parts shooting up and everything. That is when it's getting ready to start reproducing, basically. Club moss and fern. Notice ferns. Promise you, everybody has seen a fern. These do tend to be located closer to water areas. You don't tend to just look in a backyard and see a random fern unless somebody's watering it like crazy. Seed plants. The seed plants have sperm-transporting pollen grains that protect the embryos and seeds. So we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms mean naked seed. So these are going to be things like your pines, your pine trees. These, you get the seeds that are in cones. Angiosperms are in protective ovaries. These are going to be your flowering plants and your fruits and stuff like that. So, gymnosperm, again, naked seed. These are some examples. And then we have our angiosperms. Again, these are more like the flowered ones. They have specialized seeds. Alternation of generations in plant life cycles. Plants have an alternation of generations where the haploid and diploid stages are distinct multicellular bodies. The haploid generation of a plant produces gametes, and this is called the gametophyte. The diploid generation produces spores and is called the sporophyte, just like that one little thing we saw in the last chapter. So, plant life cycle. We have the haploid. So we've got the sperm and the eggs. That's going to be basically like the pollen grain and the egg, or the seed. Fertilization happens. We have our zygote. That is the diploid, which then gives us the spores, the sporophytes. When then it goes, psh, That will give us the actual spores. The spores are going to again be haploids. And then that ends up being the gametophyte in the plant, which then continues the cycle. The moss life cycle is very similar. This is just showing you how it breaks down so you can see the difference between the male and the female portions of it. Yeah, there you go. And then the fern life cycle. The fern life cycle is the one that I actually find kind of interesting, because if you look right below the word meiosis, you see that frond. That is the part of the fern that I was talking about. If you see those little bitty dots, those are all holding the little spores in there. And I remember a lab I used to get to do where we had these fern fronds preserved in alcohol, I guess, something. We put it underneath the microscope, and then as it dried, they would open and go poof, and you'd see them just puff out. And that's kind of how they, spread them out. There's the close-up of them. So if you see this on the underside of a fern, this does not mean it's diseased. This is how they literally reproduce. Checkpoint question. What is the major difference between the moss and the fern life cycles? Well, mosses, the dominant plant body is the gametophyte, but in ferns, the sporophyte is dominant and independent of the gametophyte. Now we have two groups of seedless plants that form vast ancient forests in low-lying wetlands during the Carnivorous period. So this is a long, long time ago. When these plants died, they formed peat deposits that eventually became coal. This was, again, after hundreds of millions of years. They were just under lots and lots of pressure, lots of heat, and then this created coal. We already know that we tend to burn fossil fuel on a regular basis, way more than we really should, and we're running out of it. What happens is when we burn the fossil fuels, it releases the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our air, into our atmosphere, and it's causing the warmer climate. So that is what is literally adding to our current climate crisis. As temperatures dropped during the late Carnivorous period, what happened was the glaciers formed and the climate turned drier. The wind dispersed pollen and protective seeds gave seed plants an advantage. So if everything was getting colder, things were getting drier, and a chunk of the plants relied on water to reproduce, clearly the advantage, the evolutionary advantage, would be the ones that have the pollen and the protective seeds. So how did the tropical swamp forest contribute to global cooling in this period? Well, photosynthesis by the abundant plant life reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is a gas that traps heat. Now, Gymnosperms and angiosperms. These guys have pollen grains that carry their sperm-producing cells through the air. So yes, literally, when your car is covered in pollen, it is literally covered in plant sperm. So go ahead and mess with some people's heads on that one. If a pollen grain lands on a compatible female structure, then that's when we have pollination. Undergoes mitosis, produces a sperm. Seed plants, the sperm's reduced to a nucleus. The zygote develops in a sporophyte embryo, and the ovule becomes a seed. This stores food and a protective seed coat. So, for our gymnosperm, we have pine cones. So we have a male pine cone and a female pine cone. This is why it's called naked seed for the gymnosperms. It's all right there. It's not inside anything. It's just out in the air. How do pollen and seeds increase the reproductive success of seed plants? Well, because the pollen transfers the sperm to the eggs without the need for water. So this tremendously helps. And then the seed will protect, nourish, and help disperse the plant embryos. Mainly because when we talk about the angiosperms, when we talk about fruit, think about when an animal eats an apple. They don't tend to eat around the core. The average animal eats the whole thing, so then they actually eat the seeds as well. Then they go walking along. I normally use a horse for this imagery. They walk along and then they poop. So they make these perfect little fertilized packets of apple seeds. And it makes it easier for the apple tree to grow. There you go. Now, flowers are the sites of pollination and fertilization, which is why you will be learning about flowers. Flowers house separate male and female parts. We have sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. And that's to make it basic. We have a picture coming up in just a moment. The sepals are the part at the bottom, so when you see a flower and you think it's a bud, that's basically the sepals you're seeing. Those open up and then the flower is inside. So these sepals are not actually leaves. Leaves are farther down. The sepals are what's covering up the bud. Think of it almost like a collar when it opens. Then we have the petals. The petals, I'm pretty sure you know what a flower petal is. This is what normally will attract an animal pollinator, whether it is a scent or whether it is a color. It will do something that attracts the pollinator. Then we have the male part, which will be the stamen. Includes a filament and an anther. And again, we have a picture coming up that will show it in detail. The anther is the part that helps release the pollen. And then we have the carpels, which is the female part, and it consists of the stigma, style, and ovary. And in the ovary, we have the ovule. So what happens here is when the pollen lands on the stigma, it then can go down the style into the ovary, and then it fertilizes the egg, the seed that is in the ovule. So here's the image that I said was coming. Later this quarter, you will have a document that says for practice labeling, and you will be labeling all the parts of a flower. And no, I will not be providing a word bank. You will have to actually have learned these words. You will need to specify receptacle, sepal, petal, carpel, stigma, style, ovary, stamen, anther, filament. And then I always say for extra credit, tell me which one is the male part, which one is the female part. So you will need to label all of these, but I tend to use a slightly different image. Okay, checkpoint question. Where are the male and female sporangia located in flowering plants? Well, there you go. Anthers for the male, ovules for the female. Here is yet another life cycle picture. This is about the angiosperms. It's just showing you the way the flowers work. Are you going to have to draw and label this for one of my tests? No. What is the difference between pollination and fertilization? Well, pollination is the transfer of the pollen. Fertilization is when the egg and sperm come together and make a zygote. So there you go. Fruits. Fruits are the ripened ovaries of flowers. Adaptations that help disperse seeds. A moment ago, I referred to the apple. So I love messing with people and pointing out that every time they're eating an apple, they're eating an ovary. I could say that with more than an apple. It's literally any fruit. That's what a fruit is. The entire purpose of the fruit is to help disperse the seeds. It's to help move them all around. Now, other seed dispersal mechanisms can include wind or attaching to an animal, and I have pictures coming up in a second. And then what I was just talking about, the fleshy edible fruits. And so then they eat them, walk off, and then poop out the seeds down the road. So here we go. We have the seed dispersal of wind. So anyone who's ever picked one of these up, made a wish, and blown, you have helped pollinate. Then these little burr things, that poor dog, these are the things that end up just attaching to you when you walk through them, and you know they're going to get knocked off at some point, and that's how they spread around anywhere. And then the fruit that any animal eats. Here they're showing a tiny bird eating one, but again, I say apples because apples. Now, angiosperms sustain us and add spice to our diets. Angiosperms are so important to our nutrition. We get corn, rice, wheat, and other grains. All of those are considered dry fruits. So all of that, it comes from an angiosperm. Apples, cherries, oranges, tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, fleshy fruits. Yes, they are counted as fruits. Presumably, you have heard that a tomato is a fruit. but so is a squash and a cucumber. I love messing with people about this because I will talk about wanting a fruit soup when I'm having his tomato soup. You can just completely mess with people on these. Spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, all of these are, again, from angiosperm fruits. And pepper fruits, this is where we get our peppercorns. So pepper is actually a fruit. These are all developed by angiosperms in order to spread their seed. Suppose you found a cluster of pepper berries like this one. Would you know that they are fruits? Oh, well, before this class, probably not. But now, yeah. Each berry has a seed inside. That is why it is considered a fruit. Flowers attract pollinators by color and scent. I mentioned that a moment ago when I talked about the petals. And then this tends to reward the pollinator with either nectar or pollen. What happens is birds have no sense of smell, but birds look at color. So when you find, and I think I mentioned this in a previous PowerPoint, but when you find a plant that is very, very colorful, very bright, but when you sniff it, there's no smell whatsoever, you know that that is being pollinated by a bird. If it has a scent, then that tends to be pollinated by an insect or something else. This is why the really nice, sweet-smelling flowers, you will see bees and butterflies around them, but it's not a whole bunch of birds unless the birds are trying to eat the bees and butterflies. Yeah, so here you go. Long-tongued birds, because the flower is red and has long floral tubes. That's why you would assume that's what this pollinator would need to be. So, most of the world's population is now fed by varieties of rice, wheat, corn, and soybeans that require very specific cultivation techniques. The plant biodiversity is being lost through extinction and habitat destruction. We are 100% destroying a lot of the habitat. And some new crops may come from the hundreds of species of nutritious fruits, nuts, and grains that people gather and use locally. We talked briefly about GMOs in Bio 123, and so that's part of what this is talking about, but the habitat destruction is huge. When you go into your textbook, it's going to talk also about the Amazon rainforest like this. The Amazon rainforest, when you think of it, you should be thinking of nothing but greenery, a whole lot of plants. Notice how much of the rainforest when this picture was taken was already gone. Now do yourself a favor and Google what the Amazon rainforest looks like now. And that is what's going to be your hybrid assignment of this week. I want you to actually look up what the Amazon rainforest looks like now. And I mean as in the year 2020. I want you to tell me what kind of shape the Amazon rainforest is in. How much of it are we losing due to habitat destruction? And give me the link as to where you found this information and summarize it for me. That is your hybrid assignment for week 2. Now, checkpoint question. Name 2 ways in which the loss of plant diversity might affect the world's future supply of food. Well, you might lose a lot of the crop plants. And it's possible that useful genes carried by wild ancestors or close relatives could be lost. If we are controlling every aspect of the plant, a lot of the beneficial parts that grow, evolve from cross-pollination, from the animals moving it around, that's going to be lost. Finally, we are to fungi. These are heterotrophic eukaryotes that acquire their nutrients by absorption. So again, fungi are not plants. They are not autotrophs. They are heterotrophs. They have to get their food somewhere else. So what they do is they basically excrete something that dissolves the food and then they slurp it up like a big straw. This is the reason why when something is rotting, you find fungi. They're liquefying and pulling it in. That's pretty much what they're doing. So Usually consists of a mass of thread-like filaments called hyphae, which branch repeatedly as they grow, forming what's known as a mycelium. And then there's a symbiosis between fungi and plant roots. Talked about this at the very beginning. You're about to see pictures. What happens is a lot of the fungi will work together with the plant roots to where you might think that it's destroying the plant, but in reality, it's increasing the surface area so the plant can actually absorb more nutrients and it becomes a bigger, healthier plant. And in turn, it's feeding the fungus. So pretty cool. All right, so this is pretty much the fungus. What you see when you say, oh, look, it's a mushroom, that's just the top of it. Most of it is actually underground. This is why, depending on where you live, you have a different assumption about mushrooms. Where we are, here in Georgia, Atlanta area, you will notice walking around, you don't see them anywhere outside until we have a very specific rain, and then you look around and you see mushrooms in people's yards. It's the craziest thing. It wasn't there before. Other areas, like in Belize, I have a friend who was laughing at me when I was talking about going for walks and being surrounded by mushrooms. He told me to just not go in caves. Well, because in Belize, they don't just pop up like they do here. They have a different type and they grow in a different way. So I don't know, just find that interesting. Contrast how fungi digest and absorb their food with the way humans eat and digest their food. Well, we don't rot it and slurp it up. So fungus digests its food externally by secreting the enzymes onto the food and then absorbing the small nutrients. So again, dissolve it, slurp it. For us, we tend to take big pieces of food, chew it up, swallow it, and then it digests inside us. Thankfully, it digests inside us. I don't want to see it. In some fungi, the fusion of the haploid hyphae produces heterokaryotic stage, containing nuclei from two parents. After these fuse, meiosis produces haploid spores. So we have the imperfect fungi. Use only asexual reproduction for storm production. Asexual reproduction for spore production. There we go. I swear it didn't feel right. This includes many species commonly called molds and yeasts. So a mold, any rapidly growing fungus that reproduces asexually by producing spores. This is what you're normally seeing when you have food that's going bad. And yes, I'm getting distracted because I'm noticing it's starting to rain all around me. Yeast refers to any single-celled fungus. I have mentioned previously I'm highly allergic to mushrooms. I am very grateful I am not allergic to yeast. So this is like the only fungus I can handle. My hypothesis on this is that I can handle a single-celled fungus, but probably not the multi-celled. Isn't that interesting? So, biologists have described more than 100,000 species of fungi. There's not a whole lot of diversity, but there's quite a bit. So, here it's just showing you a little phylogenetic tree of a few different types. Most people think of club fungi when they think of fungus because most people just think of a normal mushroom. Well, what we think of as a normal mushroom. We have morels and we have cup fungus, which I think are pretty cool, and then the club fungus. Mushrooms is the main thing most people think of when you hear a fungus. Then we have the puffball, shelf fungi, and we even have lichen. So what is one reason that these are thought to have diverged earliest in fungal evolution? Well, it's the only fungi that have flagellated spores. So there you go. Fungi supply essential nutrients to plants through the symbiotic stuff we talked about before. May also be able to digest petroleum products to clean up oil spills. This is why fungi have enormous ecological benefits. These are some of the best things for the planet. There's so many things you can do with these. Name 2 essential roles that fungi play in terrestrial ecosystems. Well, microclimate Crazy. I swear I can't do these words today. This is where the fungi helps the plants acquire nutrients from the soil, like I mentioned earlier. And then also, when soil fungi decompose dead animals, fallen leaves, and other organic materials, they release the nutrients, fertilize plant growth. So fungus, one of the most important things here. Now, a lot of people eat mushrooms and cheeses modified by fungi. Notice I said a lot of people because, again, can't eat the mushrooms, and there are people who don't eat cheese. Yeast produces alcohol and causes bread to rise. Yay, yeast. And then some fungi provide antibiotics. So like penicillin, that's a fungus. Yeah, there you go. What do you think is the function of the antibiotics that fungi produce in their natural environment? Well, block the growth of microorganisms. This because they're wanting to keep anything that's going to compete with the fungus for the nutrients and other resources. I mentioned a moment ago, lichens also fall under this category. Well, here's the lichens. Symbiotic association of millions of microscopic green algae or cyanobacteria held in a mass of fungal hyphae. Hyphae meaning that's the part that you're seeing that's above the ground and outside. Scientists have proposed that symbiosis with fungi were crucial to the colonization of land by plants. So to test this, they have pursued 3 lines of evidence: present-day relationships, fossils of early land plants, and molecular genetics. Molecular genetics, they've been doing more and more because it's answering a lot of the questions that were left open previously. What prediction is tested by the fossil evidence discussed in this module? About the plant-fungus symbiosis. Oh my gosh, we talked about it a lot now, didn't we? So, of the 100,000 known species of fungi, about 30% are either parasites or pathogens in or on plants. Many fungi are serious agricultural pests that cause tremendous economic losses, and some attack food crops and are toxic to humans. We also have things like athlete's foot and stuff. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I am going to go into ergot. I always go into this because this is the part that I find the most fascinating. This is on rye grain. So it is a fungus that grows on rye, and it is the cause of the Salem witch trials. And I always mention this, and then I always end up asking you about it. So this is going to be part 2 of that lecture assignment. So not only do you have to show me that you have looked more about the Amazon rainforest, you need to tell me about ergot and the Salem witch trials. What happened back then is they decided these people were witches because of stuff they were doing, and people were convinced that they were hearing voices, they were talking to God or talking to Satan. They were behaving erratically and all of this stuff, and it turns out it was mostly ergot poisoning. It was the poorer groups of people because they were eating the old rye grains, which had ergot on them. Ergot tends to be a hallucinogen. And so basically these people were tripping, and everybody thought that they were witches for it, and then they had to be proven to not be a witch by going through tests that the only way to survive is to die. So let that one sink in. You're either a witch and you get burned at the stake, or you die and you are deemed not a witch, but you're still dead. It's crazy. But all of this because of ergot poisoning. Parasitic fungi harm plants and animals. About 500 species of fungi are known to be parasitic in humans and other animals. Here you go. We've got ringworm. We have athlete's foot. We have vaginal yeast infections. There's also an overall yeast infection, so it's not just for women. Men get it too. You just can't spot it as well. Babies a lot of times will have thrush, where it's all white in the mouth, same kind of thing. So now you should be able to describe quite a few of these different little things. I glanced back over it, but I promise you we're covering so much more of the plants later. And I would start working on learning how to label your plant parts, because you will have to do that at the end of this quarter. So the next chapter is going to finally bring in our invertebrates. Yay! We're going to talk bugs and stuff. I think that's pretty much it. If you sat there and just fast forwarded, waiting to find out whether or not I mentioned the lecture assignment in this one, I did. 2 of them earlier, and I'm not recapping them, so you will have to actually watch the entire painful lecture video in order to find out what it is. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And I have now done 2 videos, 1 day. Hopefully everything's good. I have 2 more to go for this week, and next week we actually get to meet in person. Yay! So I guess that's it. And it looks like it stopped raining. Yay!